My dad called and told me that when my grandma died, he forced me to take a car back overnight. As soon as I entered the house, the coffin was already in the mourning hall and nailed shut. My parents came out with a bright yellow Taoist robe, wrapped it around me, and tied it around my waist with a hemp rope made of straw. They stuffed a big red rooster in my hand and asked me to sit on the coffin during the 3-day ritual, to be a coffin boy. I had to eat on the coffin, and even if I went to the toilet, I had to tell the Taoist priest who was doing the ritual to help me with the coffin. Only those who died tragically, died unjustly, had a lot of resentment, were prone to corpse transformation, or refused to be buried needed a coffin boy. And usually they would find a boy, or a son or grandson with strong young energy to keep the coffin. What coffin should I, a 24 or 25-year-old granddaughter, keep? Isn't there my brother's? He usually takes care of all the good things, so why would I, a girl, have to do such a strange thing as keeping the coffin? When it comes to this, Dad growled at me with a gloomy face, "If you don't want to die, don't ask too much." Mom comforted me, "Grandma loves you the most, just spend more time with her." I was confused, but there were people coming and going in the mourning hall, and those villagers were watching the excitement, as if they wanted me to make a fuss. I had no choice but to hold the rooster, climb onto the coffin, and sit sideways in the middle of the coffin as the Taoist priest said. After sitting down, looking at the smoky mourning hall next to me, and thinking that I was sitting on the coffin of my grandma who was the best to me, and I didn't even see her for the last time before she died, let alone how she died. My eyes were sore, and I couldn't help but shed tears, and my doubts became deeper and deeper. Grandma was a famous midwife in the surrounding area. She delivered at least 800 children. It is said that in the past, many fetuses with abnormal fetal positions could not be born for several days and nights, but as long as I found my grandma, the mother and child would be safe. Even now, many people still bring their grown children to visit grandma during the Chinese New Year, saying that if grandma hadn't been here, there would have been 2 dead bodies. In the past decade or so, everyone went to the hospital to give birth, and fewer people asked her to deliver babies, but she would be asked to attend the birth of pigs, cattle, and sheep. When I was at home during the Chinese New Year, she said that she would personally help me choose a partner to avoid marrying the wrong person in the future. I looked at the dark coffin and felt more and more strange. The straw rope tied around the waist and tied with the Taoist robe had a strange smell, as if it came from the coffin. When the people in the village looked over, they no longer had the respect they had for grandma before, as if their eyes were full of scrutiny. But I sat on the coffin holding a rooster, and I didn't even have a chance to talk. I sat there until noon, and I couldn't hold it any longer, so I asked the Taoist priest to hold the rooster and sit on the coffin, and then I went to the toilet. But the old Taoist priest told me that no matter what, the straw rope on my waist could not be untied, the Taoist robe could not be taken off, and I had to come over immediately after going to the toilet. He could only sit for 5 minutes at most. How can there be a set time for going to the toilet? I was about to argue, but my father just yelled at me, just like before. He scolded me for not being satisfied. He sent me to college, went out to work, and didn't care about the life and death of the family. Now my grandma is dead, and he asked me to sit in a coffin. He was still so unreasonable when scolding people. But I have been sitting here for a long time, and I haven't seen the ghost of my brother? He said he sent me to college, but the tuition and living expenses were secretly given to me by grandma, and he still asked me for money. Over the years, I have seen through it. The more he scolded, the more he was insecure, and proved that this matter was really strange. My father scolded so hard that he picked up the stick in front of the mourning hall to hit me. Fortunately, he was stopped by the people who were performing the ritual. The old Taoist priest told me helplessly to go to the toilet quickly. He really could only calm me down for 5 minutes. The toilet was behind the house. When I went there, I saw a bunch of kitchen helpers looking at something and whispering, "What sin did Chipa commit to die so strangely and tragically?" Chipa is what the villagers call my grandmother. No matter men, women, old or young, they all call her Chipa. They gathered together, eating melon seeds and staring at their phones. I leaned over to take a look and was stunned. It was a secretly recorded video of the coffin, and the person being coffined was my grandmother. She lay on the bed, staring with her eyes and mouth open, and her pale hands were tightly clasped. The one who wiped her and dressed her was the fourth grandmother in the village who was responsible for this. After wiping her body, she actually only put on a straw raincoat for my grandmother, and then used needle and thread to sew up her wide-open eyes and mouth. While sewing, she was also reciting something. I watched the black thread pass through the eyelids, oozing black and red blood, and my heart was aching like a needle. After the fourth grandmother sewed up her mouth and eyes, she went straight down with the needle, without tearing it off, and sewed the raincoat with a thread. Finally, she forced open the 10 fingers that were tightly clasped by Grandma. Grandma's hands were very small. Because of the delivery, sometimes the fetus was in an abnormal position, and she had to stretch her hands to pull, so she was well maintained. She clasped them very tightly, and the 10 fingers were crackling. After they were opened, it was obvious that several fingers were broken, and they bounced like twisted chicken claws. I was so stiff watching it. Standing behind this group of ants, I felt light all over. Kong Yemian! My father's roar suddenly came. The ants who were watching the video were startled, and they quickly put away their phones and looked at me in horror. How did Grandma die? I turned my head to look at him and said in a deep voice, how did she become like that? Staring eyes and opening mouth, 10 fingers clasped, which one of them is a normal death? You go sit in the coffin. My father picked up the broom and was about to hit me. My mother hugged me and called the ants who were eating melon seeds to drag him away. Then she said to me, Mian Mian, the time is almost up, you sit in the coffin first. Grandma likes you the most, you should go quickly, otherwise something bad will happen. Now is not the time to talk about this. Wait until Grandma is buried, and we will tell you about it, okay? Where is Kong Yuxuan? I stiffened my neck and looked at my mother. Isn't he at home? Where is he? This family's grandma is indeed the best to me, but she is even more partial to Kong Yuxuan, the eldest grandson. Every time she came back from delivering a baby, she got 10 yuan for me and had to give Kong Yuxuan 50 yuan. Why did he disappear now? Your brother went out for something. My mother's face turned blue, as if she was afraid of something, and she pushed me, go to the toilet quickly, hurry up. She was so anxious that tears fell, and her body was shaking, as if she was really scared. The ants whispered to us, wishing that the scene would be more lively. I had to go to the toilet in a hurry and followed them to sit in the coffin. Although I was a little tired, my head was clear. I thought that my parents would definitely not tell me the cause of my grandmother's death. After the burial, I had to ask the old people in the village. It was night, and I couldn't hold on any longer. My mother took a longevity blanket and spread it on the coffin. She told me to lie down on it if I was tired. I had to sit in the coffin until the coffin was buried. I could not really leave until the soil fell on the coffin. The old Taoist priest was afraid that I would fall down when I fell asleep, so he took a straw rope and tied my lower body to the coffin along my waist. He also solemnly told me that I must not leave the coffin no matter what. Even if he came to suppress it, it would only take 5 minutes. This matter became more and more weird. I stayed up until midnight, and the ritualists went to eat and smoke. I hugged the rooster and lay on the longevity blanket of the coffin, stretched my body, and rested. Faintly, I seemed to hear a gurgling sound inside the coffin. It sounded like an old man was holding phlegm, or like a rooster's throat. It sounded like something was being sewn with thread, and it was being pulled apart. Thinking of the video of my grandmother's eyes and mouth being sewn shut, I couldn't help but close my ears. Just then, a man's voice came from the side. On the day of your grandmother's funeral, when you cross the stone bridge, tear off the straw rope on your body and throw it under the bridge. You can't jump over it, and then run with the water. Don't look back, just keep running forward. This is the only way to save your life. There is only one stone slab bridge for funerals in the village. The bridge deck is quite high, the water is not deep, and it is full of large and small stones. You won't drown if you jump down, but it would be strange if your legs don't break. How can you survive? I turned around and saw a slender man in a white robe standing next to the coffin. He looked very handsome, as if he was mixed with a hint of sadness, and his whole body looked like moonlight shining on the water. Seeing me looking at him, he sighed, raised his hand and threw something to me. I'm afraid you won't have peace in these 3 days. This can save your life. Make it to the funeral. Remember to jump off the bridge on the day of the funeral. I just felt a sinking in my arms, and then something cold fell into my arms and rolled down along the coffin. I was so scared that I reached out to grab the thing, but found that it was a pebble the size of a pigeon egg. It was cold and round. But the man in white was gone, as if it was just a dream. But if it was a dream, where did the pebble come from? Just thinking about it, I heard the cuckoo sound again. A figure walked in from outside the mourning hall and knelt directly in front of the coffin. It was the 4th grandmother who was collecting Grandma's body. She must know how Grandma died. I hurriedly called her a few words, wanting to ask her about the cause of Grandma's death. But 4th Grandma seemed to not hear anything at all, and kowtowed heavily to the coffin several times. Then she raised her hand, took out the threaded needle from her pocket, and stabbed her mouth directly. The needle went down, the black thread passed over her lips, and blood gushed out. But she seemed to have no pain at all, and she worked as quickly and skillfully as she sewed up Grandma's body. When she sewed, her mouth made a gurgling sound as if there was thick phlegm stuck in it. And the rooster in my arms also made a clucking sound like a hen laying eggs. 4th Grandma knelt down and sewed her mouth shut, fast and weird. I didn't react at all, thinking it was a dream again. I pinched my hand several times, and the rooster I was holding almost fell down. Then I realized that I was not dreaming. But with this delay, 4th Grandma had sewed up her mouth with a few stitches, and pulled the thread upwards to sew up her left eye. I instinctively wanted to slide down the coffin to save her, but I was tied up by a straw rope under my waist, so I couldn't slide down at all. I had to throw the rooster I was holding to the side, while pulling the rope hard, shouting, "Hurry up! Help me!" I sat in the coffin for a day, and my throat was hoarse from the smoke of fireworks, and my voice was sharp and thin. There were relatives who came to the funeral playing cards outside, and someone was shouting. The mourning hall was also playing the Great Compassion mantra on the speakers, and my hoarse voice could not be heard at all. No one came in until I completely untied the straw rope, slid down the coffin, kicked over the copper gong against the wall, and rushed to grab the needle from the 4th grandmother's hand. But at this time, her left eye and mouth were completely sewn shut. I held her hand, and the corners of her mouth were still curled up, as if she wanted to smile. The black thread was stretched, and the blood beads rolled out one by one, which looked even more creepy. The turbid right eye was like a glass bead being moved, turning around in the eye socket. I was so scared that I was stunned. I held her hand holding the needle tightly, and kept screaming. Fortunately, the old Taoist priest outside heard the sound of the copper gong falling and rushed in. Seeing what 4th Grandma did, his face turned pale, but he pulled me over. "You sit on the coffin first, quickly. Sit on the coffin." The people who followed behind were also anxious, and hurriedly stuffed the rooster into my arms, followed my mom and dad, hugged and dragged me, and directly made me sit on the coffin first. I was almost forced by them, and turned my head to look at 4th Grandma who was left alone. "You save her first. If you don't go up, you will die." The old Taoist priest shouted at me, and then pulled the longevity blanket on the coffin. "Take the inkwell, mix it with glutinous rice juice, and wrap the coffin." As he spoke, he pulled the straw rope to tie my legs again, and said to me, "You must remember, you must not come down again. It was because you didn't hold the coffin down that 4th Grandma got into trouble. From now on, no matter what, you can't get out of the coffin, you can't drink anything, and don't go to the toilet. I'm not a magic weapon, how can I hold the coffin down? Besides, what does the matter of 4th Grandma have to do with me?" But I glanced at 4th Grandma who had completely sewed up her mouth and eyes by herself, without breaking the thread, and hung with a needle, and kowtowed mechanically again and again in front of the coffin. I thought of how she sewed Grandma's mouth and eyes, and my heart began to palpitate. The old Taoist priest and a few others dragged 4th Grandma out, and she did not struggle, and was as obedient as a puppet with a mouth and eyes sewn with thread. I don't know how they handled 4th Grandma's matter. My parents were by the coffin, one playing the good cop and the other playing the bad cop, and told me not to get into the coffin again no matter what. When the old Taoist priest came in again, he held an ink fountain and wrapped the thread around the coffin and both ends. That night, the old Taoist priest sat in the morning hall, guarding me until dawn. He was old and couldn't bear it anymore, so he replaced him with a young Taoist priest who to perform the ritual, and he sat in the coffin with me at night. Because of the accident, my parents really didn't give me food. They just gave me some water and 2 mouthfuls of noodles so that I wouldn't have to go to the toilet. How could I hold on? At noon, I was so hungry that I felt dizzy and felt that I would starve to death in this coffin. But the people who performed the ritual didn't seem to hear my voice. Until noon, my mother came to give me water. I really wanted to eat something. As soon as I opened my mouth, my mother looked at me and said, "Fourth grandma is dead." I was stunned when I heard it. The old Taoist priest came in with a sullen face, looked at me, and directly took out a 3-inch long cast iron nail, and asked my father to surround the coffin and nail one every palm width, and nail a circle. Then he said to me, "Have you seen the video of fourth grandma burying your grandma? What did you see?" I was dizzy with hunger, and I was shocked by the death of fourth grandma. Why was I confused by the old Taoist priest's question? Puzzled, he said, "Those ants have the video, go and see it." What did it mean to ask me what I saw? Speak. The old Taoist priest's face turned pale, and he shouted at me, "What did you see?" It was just that grandma's mouth and eyes were sewn up with thread. I was even more confused by his shouting. What else? The old Taoist priest asked again. My mother was holding the water, shaking all over, and she pulled the old Taoist priest away and said to me, "When your fourth grandma died, her mouth and eyes that were cut open were sewn up again, and she also cut open her stomach, stuffed a lot of eggs into it, and sewed it up again. She wore a straw raincoat and jumped directly from the stone bridge at the head of the village. Her hands seemed to be out of control, and her fingers were deformed. My mother was so scared that her face turned pale, and she knelt down and said to me, 'Mian Mian, you must hold the coffin well, otherwise your brother will die. I beg you.' My head was rumbling, and I was sketching the death of my fourth grandma. The next moment, my mind was full of the stone bridge at the head of the bridge. Then, if the coffin is not sealed, my brother will die. These things are not related at all. Why did my mother beg me? Until the old Taoist priest said something to my mother, dragged her away, and came to the coffin and said to me, 'Your grandmother died strangely, you should know it after watching the video. People related to this matter will be killed in revenge. She loved you the most when she was alive. If you seal the coffin, she will not have the heart to open the coffin, understand? If you don't seal the coffin well, your brother will die first, then your parents, and then other people in the village. Even me.' The old Taoist priest's eyes darkened, gritted his teeth and said, 'I will die.' How did grandma die? My head was already a mess. The old Taoist priest just shook his head at me. "It's better if you don't know. If you know, you will be the first to die." Then he asked me to sleep on the coffin before it gets dark, and I must cheer up after dark. I started to get scared, but I was so hungry that I had no strength to do anything. I had to lie on the coffin and close my eyes to rest. But not long after I lay there, I heard someone making a noise. It seemed that it was fourth grandma's daughter who was cursing. It was Kong Chipa who committed the sin. If she dies, she dies. What did my mother do wrong? It was Chipa who had to suffer with her. She was a worthless person. If she had to die, the whole Kong family would die. Oh, God, why did you harm my mother? Grandma was a midwife. She was famous for her skills in the surrounding area. It was all thanks to her. What sin did she commit? Taoist priest who seemed to be afraid that I would hear it, so he quickly turned on the recorder and turned the volume up to the maximum. It seemed that the screams outside were even louder, but I couldn't hear them at all. It seemed that, just like the old Taoist priest said, I couldn't hear why grandma died. Just like the way I saw grandma's body being collected, fourth grandma died in that way. But what does this have to do with me? And the stone bridge? Last night, the man asked me to jump off the stone bridge. Today, fourth grandma jumped off the stone bridge and fell to her death. Then should I jump? After thinking about this, I fell asleep on the coffin in a daze. When I woke up again, it was already dark. There were many more people in the morning hall than during the day. The old Taoist priest led a group of people to guard the two sides of the coffin, preparing to perform rituals all night. I was so hungry that I wanted to drink some water, but I took a mouthful of cigarettes when I opened my mouth. My throat was choking and uncomfortable, and a little hand touched my face. Two little girls with pigtails and rosy cheeks climbed onto the coffin at some point. They reached out and handed the offerings in front of the coffin to my mouth, smiling and motioning me to eat. But when has there been such a little girl in the village? I was stunned, and another one climbed up next to me, holding the clear water in front of the morning hall and feeding it to my mouth. There were even two people who reached out to help me untie the rope tied around my waist. They were busy, but the old Taoist priests were performing rituals and seemed to be unable to see them. A slightly older girl, about 5 or 6 years old, hissed at me, "Run. They want to starve you to death and bury you with your grandma. Run." I was hungry and tired, and my mind was confused, but I saw these little girls gathered around the coffin, feeding me water and food, and helping me untie the straw rope. Then I looked at the Taoist priests holding banners, copper bells, and wooden swords next to me. They seemed not to see them, and I knew something was wrong. Especially the old Taoist priest, who was at the front, holding a peachwood sword, stepping on the U-step, chanting scriptures around the coffin, and waving the peachwood sword several times over the head of the little girl sitting on the coffin, but he didn't seem to see her. I opened my mouth to shout, but the paper burning in the brazier in front of the coffin seemed to be blown by the wind and the smoke and ash all flew towards the coffin. With just a cough, the little girls had already untied the rope around my waist. The brazier burning paper money laughed like burning bamboo strips, and the flames grew longer, and the ashes all flew towards the coffin. I couldn't open my eyes because of the smoke. Without the rope, my body became even softer and fell down. Thinking of the tragic death of my fourth grandmother, I held the coffin with both hands to prevent myself from falling. The little girl who fed me water looked at me with a puzzled expression on her face, then sat on me suddenly and stretched out her hand to pry my hand apart. She whispered in my ear, "You can't be buried with your grandmother, why don't you go with us first?" As she sat on me, my whole body stiffened instantly. Although I was conscious, I couldn't move anywhere. The sound of the rituals around me was not very clear. Then I felt a pair of cold little hands prying my fingers holding the coffin apart one by one, and my body slid directly off the coffin. Those little girls seemed to clap their hands and laugh, and the sound of the flames in the brazier next to them mixed with the sound of the flames. Cross the bridge, baby cross the bridge. Just crossed the Niha bridge, and then crossed the stone bridge. Don't blame your father, don't blame your mother, only blame your own suffering. Under the stone bridge, Niha bridge, there will be no crying or suffering in the next life. I slid down from the coffin, and those who performed the ritual seemed to have just reacted, and immediately came to pull me, shouting my name, but I could only hear the songs those girls sang. The little girl riding on me slowly got up and pulled my hand. The other little girls, with their hands and feet, dragged and pulled, as if pulling me out. I felt light and floating, and my ears were full of crossing the bridge. Just when I was about to be pulled up and follow them, I suddenly heard a cold snort, "Put it down." Then something in my arms fell to the ground with a bang, and there seemed to be a sound of shattering. "The river god is coming." Those little girls seemed to be frightened, and they let me go and ran away in a swarm. I woke up instantly as if I was falling from a dream. Kong Yemian? Those who were performing the ritual hurriedly pulled me up and helped me to the coffin. I was still confused about the situation, and I supported myself on the ground with my hands, trying to turn my head to take a look. As soon as I stretched out my hand, I touched something cold, and it hurt my hand. I turned my head and saw that it was the pebble. But it had been broken into pieces of gravel. "Hurry up and get on the coffin." Taoist priest who was so anxious that his face turned blue. He reached out and picked me up, and put me on the coffin. "What are you going to do? You must tell us, and you must not pull the rope to come down by yourself. I really don't know where you got the strength to break the rope and come down." He forced me on the coffin. "Where is the chicken? Master, do you want to tie it up?" I was sitting on the coffin, and before I could figure out what happened just now, I suddenly heard the cluck sound again. I turned my head and saw the old Taoist priest holding a peachwood sword, staring at the coffin blankly. His throat seemed to be stuck with thick phlegm, and he cleared his throat with a crackling sound. Next to him, the old man who helped make incense and candles picked up the rooster I had held for 2 days. His face was blue. I saw that the rooster's neck was drooping, the chicken legs were stiff, and the wings were twisted upside down on the chicken's back, twisted upside down and tied into a knot. Especially the chicken claws, each section was twisted up and broken, just like the hand that was broken when my grandmother died. But this rooster was still alive when I held it in my arms? How did it suddenly become stiff? In the morning hall, in front of so many people? Master? Taoist who seemed to be frightened and motioned for others to hold me down. Walking towards the old Taoist, "Are you okay?" When he asked, his hand had already grasped a copper bell next to him. The old Taoist stared at the coffin, but slowly raised his head and looked at me. His mouth corners slowly opened, a little bit bigger, revealing his gums. He sang happily like those little girls just now, cross the bridge, baby cross the bridge. Master. Taoist whose face changed, and he immediately held the copper bell and was about to hit him on the back of his head. But the old Taoist turned the peachwood sword in his hand and inserted it directly into his mouth, and then rushed towards the coffin. Taoist who quickly turned his hand to pull it, but only heard a whey sound. Then a piece of peachwood sword came out from the back of the old Taoist's neck. I felt the coffin shake, so I leaned over to the side to see. I saw the old Taoist priest half bent, his head rubbing against the coffin and sliding down little by little, like a human bow. The peachwood sword was pressed against the coffin, and more blood came out from the back of his neck. Then his whole body was like a wicker branch bent upside down, his feet kicked the ground, his head bent upside down against the coffin, and his body was bent like that, motionless. This change happened too quickly, and Taoist priest who was completely stunned. He was so scared that the copper bell in his hand fell to the ground with a dong, his face was pale, and his whole body was shaking. It was the old man who was in charge of the incense and candles, who hurriedly shouted, "Hurry up and take it away, the murderous coffin cannot see blood." "Hurry!" Taoist priest who seemed to have just reacted, and quickly took off his Taoist robe, threw it towards the old Taoist priest's bent neck, tied a knot on the back of his neck, and covered the wound. Then the Taoist robe turned, pulled the body back, turned around, and walked out directly with the old Taoist priest on his back. After taking a step, he said to me, "Kong Yemian, we beg you, even if you die, you have to lie on this coffin." The old Taoist priest was now carried upside down, with his face facing me. Only the hilt of the peachwood sword was left outside, stretching his mouth wide and round, as if he was grinning. Because he was carried upside down, blood and water from his eyes and nose flowed back, all on Taoist priest who. The people who helped him held incense paper to cover the blood, fearing that some water would drip into the morning hall. Everyone outside the morning hall was so shocked that they could not speak when they saw this incident. I sat alone on the coffin, looking at the morning hall that was suddenly empty, not knowing what was going on. I turned my head to look at the side of the coffin, the broken pebbles, a little dazed. The man in white asked me to jump over the stone bridge. The little girl sang, "Crossing the bridge." What exactly is crossing the bridge? I was just standing there in a daze when I heard a sigh from the side, another retribution. I turned my head and saw the man in white standing next to the coffin. He was stretching out his slender fingers and picking up the broken pebbles one by one. "Who are you?" I hurried over, but I didn't dare to get out of the coffin again. "The next time I get out of the coffin, someone will die." I hugged the coffin tightly and looked at him with my head tilted. "Don't you remember?" The man smiled at me, pulled out a piece of yellow straw paper, wrapped the broken pebbles, and handed it to me. "Tomorrow is the last day. No matter what you see, don't get out of the coffin. Remember what I told you. When you cross the bridge, you must jump off the bridge and go with the flow. But the villagers will definitely not let you run away. You can jump off the bridge with this." The man in white handed the thing to me. "Why didn't the villagers let me run?" I didn't answer, just looked at him and said, "Will I be buried with my grandma like those little girls said?" In this family, Grandma treats me the best, that's right. But Grandma's favorite is my brother, her eldest grandson, Kong Yuxuan. If there is really a coffin, it should be him. But why does Grandma want someone to be buried with her? You are not buried with her, you are. The man in white showed sadness on his face and smiled bitterly, your grandma's substitute. He seemed reluctant to say more, took my hand, and put the cobblestone in my palm. If you want to live, remember what I said. This is the only thing I can do for you, you must remember it. His palm was slightly cool, with a breath of water. What substitute? My head became more and more confused. Just when I was about to say something, I heard my father's roar from outside, Kong Yemian. The man in white looked into my eyes with pity, covered my hand and forced me to hold the paper wrapped with cobblestone fragments. Before I could react, I felt a heavy pain on my head and stars in front of my eyes. When I opened my eyes again, I saw my father standing in front of me angrily. He clenched his fist and hit my head a few more times. I groaned in pain and stars in front of my eyes. From childhood to adulthood, he always did this when he was angry, clenching his fist and hitting my forehead with his knuckles. He either scolded me for raising me in vain or scolded me for being a woman and wanting this and that. But now he yelled at me, I asked you to put a coffin in it, but I couldn't tie you up with a rope. You killed 2 people. You really want to kill your brother and our whole family. Then let Kong Yuxuan sit in the coffin? I covered my forehead that was in pain from the beating, and somehow, I put the paper bag containing the broken stone pieces into my pocket. I looked up at him, is he afraid of death? Why should I raise you? You're still glaring at me. My father picked up the candlestick next to him and was about to throw it at me. Fortunately, my mother rushed over and hugged him. Let go. I said at the beginning that I shouldn't raise her. She should have crossed the bridge when she was born. It was my mother who wanted to raise her. Now is the perfect time. Beat her to death and bury her in the coffin with my mother. My father was still unconvinced and threw the candlestick at me. I turned my head to avoid the candlestick, but my dizzy head instantly caught a key word. What does crossing the bridge mean? My father, who was originally furious, froze in an instant, his eyes filled with fear, and he took 2 steps back in panic. My mother's face turned blue, and she hurriedly pushed my father out. This time my father did not resist at all. Instead, he didn't even dare to look at me and ran away. Mian Mian. My mother walked to the coffin and looked at me with her eyes flashing. The old Taoist priest is dead. You have to sit in the coffin obediently. It will be fine when the funeral is held tomorrow. What do you want to eat? Mom will make it for you, okay? Her eyes flashed, as if she didn't dare to look me in the eye. Aren't there 3 days of rituals? I vaguely felt something was wrong. Why is the funeral suddenly held early? And aren't I allowed to eat? My mind suddenly flashed, burial companion, substitute. And my father said, anyway, we will be buried together. Mom? I supported the coffin with my hands and tried to slide down from it. But as soon as I moved, my mother grabbed me and shouted, hurry. Outside the mourning hall, those people rushed in and pressed me down and turned me over on the coffin. Then a few ropes were tied to my hands and feet, and I was tied to the coffin. Mom. Mom. What are you doing? I was already hungry for the whole day, so how could I get away? But as soon as I opened my mouth, someone grabbed a rag from the altar, crumpled it into a ball, and stuffed it into my mouth. Mian Mian, it will be fine after the coffin is buried in the ground. My mother took a rooster with tears in her eyes. She tied the rooster's feet to my back, it will be fine soon. Following the people who were performing the ritual, they took the coffin blanket and covered me and the rooster. They only left a gap next to my head for me to breathe. I was tied to the coffin, watching my mother leave the mourning hall in disbelief, without looking back. I tried to turn my head to look at the people who were performing the rituals next to me, and they were clearly afraid. When they met my gaze, they would also avoid it, but no one was willing to help me, and no one was willing to tell me what was going on. What's more, they began to be afraid to look at me. I couldn't even struggle, because my hands and feet were entangled in the coffin, like a clam spider. Taoist master who changed into a Taoist robe and came in. His face was dark. He glanced at me, turned his head, and began to perform the ritual. The morning hall became lively again, as if the death of the old Taoist priest just now was just a small episode. In addition to the outside of the morning hall, there were wailing cries from time to time. After 2 nights of hard work and a day of hunger, the struggle just now was exhausting. I don't know when I fell asleep in this noisy sound. I don't know if I was awakened by hunger, or by the sound of sky rockets, or the sound of carrying coffins. Only then did I realize that the coffin had been carried to the gate. My father was wearing mourning clothes and holding the portrait. My brother, who had not shown up, was carrying a bamboo sieve with offerings, and holding a banner for descendants. The road was full of people, many of whom came to see Grandma during the New Year. They were all wearing mourning clothes at this time, with numbness or relief on their faces. No one looked at me. Taoist who performed a roadside sacrifice. I don't know who stretched out his voice and shouted, "All evil spirits should avoid it, the funeral is here." As the call was sounded, Taoist who unfolded a piece of white paper, and asked for the names of the evil spirits of heaven, earth, yin and yang, day and time, and read them out again. He was afraid that people would not understand, so he said that people of a certain zodiac sign and a certain time of birth must avoid it. He even said it 3 times and asked people to ask around. The whole process was very serious, and even the village chief and others took it very seriously. Taking advantage of this gap, Lao Jiang, who was helping to burn incense and candles, specially gave cigarettes to the coffin bearers. "I'm afraid this coffin is difficult to lift. Let's work together and follow my gestures to lift the coffin together." The 8 coffin bearers glanced at me who was holding the coffin, and they all smoked silently and nodded with heavy faces. As they avoided what they should avoid, they killed chickens to lead the way, and Taoist who burned the road pass. But the strange thing was that when the money for the guide was scattered, a strong wind suddenly blew in the air. Handfuls of paper money floated up with the wind, and did not fall to the ground at all, floating up and down with the wind. Taoist whose face was gloomy, and he grabbed a handful of rice and threw it into the air. The rice grains fell on the paper money, and the paper money just shook for a while, but was blown up again by the wind. If paper money doesn't fall to the ground, ghosts won't enter the underworld. The oldest coffin bearer glanced at me and puffed on his cigarette. "This toll can't be used, everyone should be alert this time." Taoist master who was also tense, but when the funeral was about to start, he could only shout, "Prepare." The coffin bearers immediately lowered their waists and took a breath, waiting for the order to lift the coffin at the same time. At this moment, I suddenly heard a giggle again. The rooster tied to my back seemed to start clucking like a hen laying eggs, but before lifting the coffin, several rounds of firecrackers had to be set off, and those people didn't seem to hear the rooster's strange cry. With a shout, "Lift the coffin!" The coffin bearers who lowered their waists and took a breath shouted at the same time, "Ha!" Then they simultaneously supported the pull and exerted force. Just at this moment, my body tied to the coffin shook twice. The coffin bearers jumped up all of a sudden, and the one behind almost jumped up because he used too much force. Fortunately, the people who were doing the ritual were watching and quickly supported the coffin. The coffin was lifted, but the rope was not tightened, as if it was floating. My father and brother seemed to be relieved when they saw the coffin, and they quickly fired a cannon to signal them to move quickly. The coffin bearers all looked unhappy, but they had already been issued a pass, so they had to move forward, so they had to bite the bullet and carry the coffin forward. I lay on the coffin, looking at the half-loose rope, and I knew something was wrong. Even if the coffin was empty, the rope would not be loosened by the coffin and me. But my father and brother really thought it was okay, and when they met the roadside sacrifice, they immediately knelt down and bowed back. My grandmother usually had a good reputation in the village. There were people who didn't have to pass by for the funeral, and they specially set up a table not far from my door, put in incense and candles, scattered paper money, and set off firecrackers. But no matter who scattered the paper money, it would be blown by the wind and float in the air, floating and sinking, but never falling to the ground. As the funeral procession moved forward, the paper money floating in the air became more and more dense, like ghosts, following the funeral procession. Those who sent the spirits also felt something was wrong and began to whisper. The sound of firecrackers continued, and no one except me could hear the rooster clucking all the way. It sounded like a hen had just laid an egg, or like it was cackling strangely. After offering sacrifices to a few families, many children ran to the side of the road, either fluttering the paper money in the air to play, or picking up firecrackers to play. They gathered in groups of 3 or 5, running around the coffin, picking up the paper money and singing, "Ghosts carry the coffin, the rooster crows, filial sons and grandsons should not laugh first. Paper money is floating, incense is burning, and the incense and candles are burned out and the underworld is gone." Their voices were also in unison, just like reading a text in a school classroom. Moreover, they were running around, picking up firecrackers from time to time, lighting them with incense and throwing them around. My father and Kong Yuxuan, who had been relieved to see the coffin lifted up, began to look gloomy. Taoist master who immediately signaled others to drive these children away. I was lying on the coffin, and I looked around. I listened to them singing "Ghosts Carrying Coffins," and then looked at the light ropes of the coffin, and hurriedly lowered my head to look down. But I was tied in the middle of the coffin, with my head down and my chin against the coffin lid, and I couldn't see under the coffin. I had to tilt my head on the coffin and look to one side. But I still couldn't see the situation under the coffin, and could only peek down a little bit along the coffin board. But I saw a group of pale little hands, sticking to the coffin, and trying to hold it up. Perhaps because she felt that I was watching, the little girl who sat on me last night suddenly jumped out from the front of the coffin. She grinned at me, then shrank back. Only a pair of pale little hands were left, holding up the coffin. No matter how stupid they were, I knew now that they were all ghosts. Taoist priest who also began to get scared because of the nursery rhymes those children sang, so he caught a live rooster and killed it while someone was offering sacrifices on the road. He mixed chicken blood with rice, filled a liter of rice, and handed it to the incense burner. Before I understood what was going on, the incense burner walked towards me with the liter of rice. Every step he took, he grabbed a handful of rice and sprinkled it on my head. The rice mixed with chicken blood, with a sticky smell, was sprinkled heavily on my head, hitting my face and hurting my skin, and some even fell into my eyes. As the chicken blood and rice fell, screams came from under the coffin. Then the coffin rope, which was originally light and fluttering, was straightened little by little. The waists of the coffin bearers also became bent little by little, and they even began to be unable to walk, and the coffin fell down little by little. Taoist priest who saw this, and seemed to have been prepared, he took out a few talismans and pasted them on the coffin poles. A team of coffin bearers came over and stretched the poles to the coffin ropes. Then they shouted and lifted the coffin together. This is how the coffin didn't fall to the ground. Taoist priest who glanced at me again and directly pulled a yellow cloth with talismans painted on it to cover my eyes. I couldn't see anything in an instant, but I could feel the coffin being lifted up. It seemed that everything went smoothly, except for the sound of firecrackers, filial sons and grandsons bowing back to the people who were offering sacrifices on the road, the sound of sewn, and even the sound of the roosters clucking. My heart became heavier little by little. Grandma died strangely. As long as I got out of the coffin, someone would die. There was also the strange thing of ghosts carrying the coffin. I think the daughter of fourth grandma cried and said sin was true. But grandma was a famous midwife in the surrounding area. She died at this time and so many people set up road sacrifices. What sin did she commit? Now Kong Yuxuan is out as a virtuous grandson, and I am a substitute. Do I really have to be buried with her? My heart ached and I began to get scared. My parents didn't like me since I was a child. I grew up with my grandmother. She was indeed the best to me in this family. But I know that she really likes only Kong Yuxuan. Every time she looks at me, she is always absent-minded. My father complained to my grandmother in front of me more than once, why did he raise me to give birth to sons for other families? If I wasn't there, he could have another son, a member of the Kong family. But every time, my grandmother would take out her private money to give him, saying that he didn't understand. Later, when I grew up and my academic performance was good, my father felt more and more sorry, saying that it would be great if my talent for studying was given to my brother, but it was a pity that it was someone else's. He got angry when he talked too much, and always felt that I had robbed Kong Yuxuan of her talent for studying. When he saw me, he either beat me or scolded me. Every time, my grandmother sighed and made soup for me. Once my father happened to come over, and in order to please him, I served him the soup and asked him to drink it. But my dad had just taken 2 sips when my grandma saw him and her face turned pale with fear. She scratched his throat to induce vomiting and poured soapy water to wash his stomach. From then on, my grandma told me that the soup was for my body and only girls could drink it. It could not be given to my dad or my brother. And my dad always felt that I was going to harm him since then. Every time he saw me, he would raise his hand to do something. So I always walked around him when I saw him. I was hungry for a day and a night. When I thought about the broth, my stomach growled. What kind of broth was that? I thought about it and it seemed to be beef tripe and lean meat soup. My grandma would stew it for me every few days and I would drink it alone. That's why everyone said that my grandma was good to me. It's just that the beef tripe in it is not very delicious and tastes fishy. But now, I am so hungry that I miss the taste a little. Maybe I ate too much when I was a child. The only thing I can remember is this broth. Grandma always told me that I was in poor health and that eating this would replenish my body, so she could only give it to me. Maybe I will never be able to eat it again in the future. I was so hungry that I was fainting when I heard the voice of a little girl singing a nursery rhyme in front of me. Cross the bridge, baby cross the bridge. With this voice, the rooster tied to my back also laughed, cluck. The coffin ropes carrying the coffin also tightened, cluck. The coffin carried by 16 people was slowly sinking. I looked up quickly, wanting to see where it was. As soon as I looked up, a gust of wind blew up, blowing the white flags whirring, and the paper flowers on the wreaths rustled. In this gust of wind, I seemed to hear the sigh of the man in white again. Then the bright yellow cloth covering my eyes was torn away by a white and transparent hand. Only then did I realize that I had arrived at the stone bridge that must be crossed for funerals in the village. Gusts of evil wind blew the guide, money floating in the air. On the stone bridge, a group of little girls, big and small, held hands, circled 3 times inside and 3 times outside like playing games, jumping and singing, just crossed the Naiha bridge, and crossed the stone bridge again. I don't blame my father, I don't blame my mother, I only blame my own suffering. Naiha bridge under the stone bridge, I won't cry or suffer in the next life. Crossing the bridge again. As they sang, the coffin seemed to be getting heavier and heavier, and the ropes were getting tighter and tighter. 2 groups of 16 coffin bearers shouted in the wind, trying to carry the coffin, but it was still useless. Their bodies were bent lower and lower, and the clucking laughter of the rooster tied to my back mixed with the shouting, and actually suppressed the shouting. This time everyone around heard the strange clucking laughter of the rooster. I tried to raise my head to see what was going on. But when I raised my head, I saw the man in white standing in front of the coffin, pointing at the stone bridge with pity on his face. At the same time, my hand suddenly touched the paper bag he gave me. I suddenly had a good idea in my heart, and I rolled my fingers, broke the thin paper money, and took out the broken stone pieces inside. Strangely enough, the stone pieces seemed to be extremely sharp. As soon as I turned my fingers and cut the rope, the grass rope as thick as a thumb broke immediately. I hurriedly cut the rope quietly under the longevity blanket while they were not carrying the coffin forward. Just as I cut all the ropes on my body, the chicken on my back suddenly raised its neck, cluck. Cluck. It stood up long, and its feet grabbed my back, as if it had great strength, pressing down. The coffin, which was getting heavier little by little, fell to the ground with a bang. I was not tied with a rope, and I was instantly shaken off the coffin. I was dizzy from the fall, and I used my hands and feet to move, but I couldn't get up yet. Then I heard my dad yelling, "Catch her quickly. If she is not buried with the coffin, all of you who were born by my mom will die. Quick!" I was stunned for a moment. Does that mean I really have to be buried with my grandma? Why do all those who were born by my grandma have to die? Seeing the people escorting the dead on the roadside, as well as my father and brother, and those who were performing rituals, all rushed towards me. My heart was tense, and I didn't think much, so I rolled on the ground and rolled under the coffin. At this time, the evil wind blew stronger and stronger, and the paper wreaths were blown to pieces. Not to mention that I couldn't open my eyes, I was blown all over the place. I took the opportunity to use my hands and feet, almost crawling, and climbed up the stone bridge from the crowd in the chaos. The man in white was half floating on the bridge, waving at me and motioning me to go over. The strange thing was that he asked me to run with the water, but he was standing upstream of the bridge. If I ran with the water, I would have to pass under the bridge. But now, I chose to believe him. I crawled to the bridge with my hands and feet, pulled off the straw rope tied around my waist, and the Taoist robe. As I threw the straw rope with a strange smell under the stone bridge, the female ghost children clapped their hands and laughed at me. I didn't even have time to see where the water was under the stone bridge. I gritted my teeth and jumped in. It was strange, the water was usually only up to my knees, but it seemed to rise instantly when I jumped in. The current lifted me up and I floated in the water. I choked on the water and tried to get up with my hands and feet. I heard Taoist who shouting on the bridge, "She wants to use the water escape to fake her death and cross the bridge. Smash the rocks quickly, don't let her pass through the bridge hole. Otherwise, those things will come out with her and go home for revenge." I was in the water, and before I could stand up, I was hit by something. My body fell heavily into the water again, but this time the water didn't seem to be deep, only up to my knees. I stretched out my hand to stand up, and the back of my head was hit hard. My mother cried, "Mian Mian, don't make trouble, come up quickly, be good. Save your brother." Save my brother? Let me be buried with my grandmother, bury me, save my brother? But I was hungry and dizzy, and with the rocks hitting me, I couldn't get up. Just then, the face of the man in white appeared under the water, and the water seemed to hold up a pair of hands and help me up. "Go through the bridge hole, run with the water, don't look back. Quick!" He pushed me eagerly. A wave rushed up, and my body was lifted up. I didn't care about the things that were hitting me, and ran down with the water. Behind me, my parents were crying and shouting, and those people were shouting, "She is going through the bridge hole, hit it quickly. Hit it quickly." And those girls giggled, "Cross the bridge, cross the bridge, cross the bridge quickly." I ran along the water. The pebbles in the river that were originally slippery didn't seem to be slippery at all. Every step I took seemed to be on solid ground, and even the water seemed to be supporting me. My mother cried and shouted behind me, "Mian Mian, come back, don't run. If you run away, it will kill your brother. I beg you, come back quickly and save your brother." In her eyes, using my life to save my brother is justified. If I refuse, I will harm him. "Quick, she is going through the bridge hole, go down and chase her, don't let her go through the bridge hole." Taoist who said in a hurry. Someone seemed to yell behind me, and then someone jumped down. Just as the water splashed, I stepped on the water and got into the bridge hole under the stone bridge. The cold breath instantly froze my whole body. The river is not deep. During the summer vacation, a bunch of children moved crabs in the river. The adults in the village, no matter who saw it, would tell them not to go under the stone bridge, because there were ghosts in the bridge hole. Some curious people asked the teacher, who said that it was cool under the bridge and there would be snakes and insects hiding, so it was not safe. When I ran under the stone bridge, it was like entering an ice storage, and my whole body was cold. I seemed to hear the giggles of little girls behind me, and in the laughter, there were also the cries of babies, and the heart-wrenching screams of women, and the painful sobs and wails. Some people even shouted heart-wrenchingly, "Seventh wife. Seventh aunt. Why did you hurt me? Why did you hurt my child?" Those people's voices seemed to be extremely resentful, as if they were right behind my head, constantly roaring and shouting resentfully. I finally knew why I couldn't turn back. I gritted my trembling teeth and went straight through the bridge hole, trying to run down the water. But as soon as I got out of the bridge hole, the light outside came on, and I saw a dozen people, their trouser legs soaked, standing outside the bridge hole, reaching out to stop me. The stream itself was not wide, but the river bank was built quite high. On the other side of the bridge hole, there were also people chasing me. I had no place to run unless I stayed in the bridge hole. Even now, those who were chasing me did not dare to enter the bridge hole. But those resentful voices were still shouting behind me. I didn't dare to look back, for fear that I would be swallowed up if I looked back. Master Hu shouted in a deep voice, "Kong Yemian. Do you know how many people you want to kill?" When he shouted in a deep voice, he threw something down and hit my knee. I was already exhausted, and I ran all over again. I was shocked and scared. After being hit by him, my legs softened and I fell directly into the river. But those people didn't come forward to pull me, but looked up at Master Hu on the bridge. He sighed and said coldly, "She has passed through the bridge hole. Pull her up first. She may be useful if you keep her." I felt my legs were sore and weak at this time, and I was completely exhausted. I couldn't figure out what was going on. Just when the two people pulled my arms and dragged me up, I suddenly heard a sigh from the side and turned my head to take a look. I saw the man in white with a group of girls standing outside the bridge hole, looking at me. Those girls smiled at me and waved at me. But in the dark bridge hole, countless women with wet hair, blood all over their lower bodies, bulging bellies, and sobbing with their heads down, stood under the bridge hole, staring at me resentfully. Just as I looked over, they suddenly looked up at me. With a fierce look on their pale faces, they suddenly stretched out their hands to pounce on me, "Seven partner." But the man in white shouted in a deep voice, and those people seemed to be very afraid of him, and then shrank back very unwillingly. I looked at the scene in the bridge hole a little confusedly. Is there really a ghost under this bridge hole? Those people pulled me and forced me to the river bank. The people above pulled me up with their hands and feet. Everyone was silent, even the wind stopped, and the paper money floating in the air slowly fell. But it just fell on the river. In just a moment, the entire river surface was scattered with guide money. The soul of the baby girl by the bridge hole, stepping on paper money, walked along the water without looking back. They were still singing, cross the bridge, baby cross the bridge, just cross the Naiha bridge, and then cross the stone bridge. Don't blame father, don't blame mother, only blame yourself for suffering. Naiha bridge under the stone bridge, no crying and no suffering in the next life. The man in white watched them go away stepping on paper money, smiled at me, and turned into the bridge hole. Those women covered in blood and disheveled hair seemed to have disappeared. I sat at the end of the bridge, and seemed to have vaguely guessed what was going on. Just at this moment, my head suddenly hurt. My father clenched his fist and hit me. "I'll beat you to death, let you run. Let you run, I raised you so big in vain, you want to kill the whole family." This time my mother didn't stop it, and the others seemed to be silent, just saying a symbolic word, and didn't even come forward to pull. After a while, my head seemed to be numb, but I didn't have the strength to struggle. In the end, Master Hu shouted in a deep voice, "Stop it." Then he glanced at me, looked at the coffin that had already landed, and said in a deep voice, "The coffin has landed, and it is buried in peace." The old saying is indeed like this. Once the coffin has landed, it must be buried on the spot. If it is opened again, it will become a corpse. Moreover, my grandmother's death was strange, and I am afraid that no one would dare to lift the coffin again. But the coffin landed steadily in the middle of the road, right next to the bridge. Not to mention that it cannot be driven, even when there are many people, it is not easy to walk on the road. No one said that it was buried in the middle of the road, right? This is unreasonable. The village chief quickly pulled Master Hu aside and talked to him, and the people who were sending the coffin next to him became indignant. It seemed that they had made great efforts for my grandmother's funeral, and some people even came back from afar to ask for my grandmother to be buried in peace, but this happened during the funeral. On one hand, they accused Master Hu of being useless and not as powerful as his master. On the other hand, they accused my brother, saying that if he hadn't caused trouble, Grandma wouldn't have died so tragically, and this wouldn't have happened. Master Hu was surrounded by them and kept talking. He glanced at me, who was soaked all over, and said, "Take her to the old house of Grandma Chi and lock her up first. For this coffin, we'll build a mourning shed and I'll think of a way." He seemed really scared, and his face was so gloomy that it seemed like water was dripping out. I was dragged and looked back. The female baby souls who stepped on the guide money and left with the water were gone. It seemed even darker under the bridge hole, as if it was another world from outside the hole. My dad and the others were also worried about Grandma's coffin and had no time to take care of me. It was a few aunts who took me to Grandma's old house. They dragged me all the way and looked at me with curiosity and sympathy. I could vaguely hear a few people whispering behind me. She was raised by Grandma Chi since she was young, just to be a substitute and go to Yama Palace to atone for her sins. Really? This is her granddaughter? She raised her by herself, how can she be so cruel? Granddaughter? Hasn't she asked other people's granddaughters to cross the bridge often? If she doesn't cross the bridge, why does she need to raise a substitute? TSK. I didn't know Grandma Chi would do such a thing, so immoral. At that time, there was nothing I could do. She didn't just cross the bridge. I heard that she helped people deliver babies and secretly made many people become midwives. Hey! Didn't I hear before that her Xiao Xian hooked up with the silly woman from Blind Chen's family? Many people saw this, sometimes under the bridge, sometimes on the slope behind. Smack, taking advantage of the blind Chen who couldn't see, 2 pieces of candy tricked the silly woman into sleeping with him once, and he didn't mind. Later, the silly woman got pregnant, but she was stupid and didn't know. Others didn't want to be evil, and didn't dare to blame the 7th wife, so no one pointed it out. Blind Chen couldn't see it either. When the baby was about to be born, the silly woman complained of stomachache, and then Blind Chen knew about it. He insisted that the child was not his. The village chief was afraid of causing trouble, so he called the 7th wife to deliver the baby. After all, it was Xiaoshuan's seed. I heard that the baby was about to be born, and the 7th wife. The aunt clapped her hands. She stretched forward with her right hand clenched, she stuffed the child back again, and the silly woman was tortured to death. When I heard this, I turned my head and looked at the aunt. There was indeed a blind Chen in the village, and he married a silly woman. That silly woman is not really silly, it's just that her mother was mentally retarded and her father was a bit mentally ill and often beat her, so she has always been timid. Her family was poor and she never went to school. When she was a teenager, she was sold to Blind Chen by her father for a few hundred yuan. I suddenly remembered that during the Chinese New Year, Kong Yuxuan secretly put 2 bottles of 8 treasure porridge I bought for my grandmother in his pocket. I caught him and glared at me. Once I came back from the town, I saw him sneaking out from under the bridge hole with that silly woman. At that time, the silly woman's clothes were all wet. Kong Yuxuan also said that he saved her and asked me to find an old set of clothes for her to change. I didn't think much about it at the time, but now I hear these aunts say so. Kong Yuxuan actually used 8 treasure porridge and other things to deceive that silly woman, in that bridge hole. I think so. Under the bridge hole, there are 2 plains more than 1 meter wide on the left and right, covered with grass, and by the water. In addition, the village has been using ghosts to scare people, so most people would not even look inside. Even if they looked, the light was dim and they could not see anything. So what if they saw it? Everyone knew what disgusting things were going on in the village, but they would not point it out. But even if Blind Chen refused to admit that the child was his, the silly woman would give birth to it. Why did Grandma push the child who was already in labor back? I don't know why, but I suddenly thought of Grandma's well-maintained, small and white hands. When she died, each finger was broken and bent like a broken chicken claw. I asked those aunts how my grandma died. But when they heard me ask, they seemed to be afraid of me and didn't tell me more. They pushed me all the way to the old house and locked me in the room where my grandma lived. Many people saw me along the way, and I also called for help. But no matter who I called, they seemed to ignore me. I was very familiar with my grandma's room. She believed in Buddhism and would burn a stick of incense every morning and evening. It always smelled of sandalwood, but now it smelled of corruption. They were afraid that I would run away again, so they nailed the doors and windows shut. I was soaked all over, so I had to find Grandma's clothes from the closet to change, and found some hidden biscuits and other things to fill my stomach, and then I felt better. Curled up in bed, thinking about the weird things in the past 3 days, I fell asleep in a daze. In my dream, I seemed to have become my grandma. The silly woman, whose lower body was almost soaked in blood, kept wailing in pain, 7-year-old. 7-year-old. The child's head had already appeared, but it had no black hair. The top of the head was covered with countless thick dandruff the size of fingernails, which looked like human faces. As the head was pushed out little by little, the faces on the dandruff began to become distorted. It seemed that along with the silly woman, she screamed again and again, 7-year-old. 7-year-old. Then the hands that always stroked my head held the baby's head steadily, but did not drag it out, but pushed it in hard. One hand even reached in along the baby's head. The silly woman screamed in pain, 7-year-old. But as the old saying goes, a fool is strong, and with her scream, the baby's head that had just been pushed in came out again. Then the silly woman's face, which was distorted with pain, suddenly giggled. I heard that laughter and felt extremely scared. It was exactly like the rooster's laugh in my arms when I was holding the coffin. Grandma Chi, let your great-grandson cross the bridge quickly? Send him to Naiha Bridge? Cluck. Cluck. The silly woman even sat up slowly. As she laughed, the dandruff on the baby's head that had just been exposed seemed to turn into a mouth, and it also laughed cluck. I couldn't see Grandma, I could only see that the hands held the baby's head again. This time, both hands reached in at the same time, and even clasped it tightly, and turned it a little. Blood gushed out instantly, and the well-maintained hands were instantly soaked in the blood. More blood dripped down Grandma's arm. Cluck. Cluck. The silly woman laughed even louder, but then her eyes jumped, and she screamed in pain like a pig being slaughtered. The bulging belly, the fetus that was forced in, struggled hard inside, and blood flowed down in streams. After a while, the silly woman stopped moving. And Grandma took needle and thread from the shabby cabinet next to her and sewed up the bottom. Then she came out and said to Blind Chin, she is a silly woman who doesn't know how to use force. She didn't give birth, and there are 2 dead bodies. Blind Chin just chuckled and tried to get up with a bamboo stick, but my brother chased him and hit him in the back. But that time it seemed like a kick on me, my body sank down suddenly and I woke up instantly. Then I heard a knock on the window from outside, Mian Mian. Kong Mian Mian. The villagers didn't know my full name, they only knew that Grandma called me Mian Mian, and usually called me, and adding a surname became Kong Mian Mian. I got busy and looked at the window. The old-fashioned square lattice window had a fist-sized hole in the lower left corner of the glass, which was just right for seeing outside. The one who called me was Aunt Cheen, the daughter of 4th Grandma. Her eyes were red and swollen at this time, and she was indescribably excited. When she saw me, she immediately giggled at me. I heard that you jumped off the stone bridge and ran through the bridge hole. Yes, that's how it should be. They committed the evil themselves, why should other people's lives save them? What's going on? I was still groggy at this moment, and my heart palpitated when I thought of the dream just now. Aunt Cheen took out a bottle of water from her bosom and handed it to me. Drink it. The coffin is now parked in the middle of the bridge at the entrance of the village, and everyone in the village is having a headache. Even if someone's family has not asked your grandmother to deliver a baby, there are relatives who have asked your grandmother to deliver a baby, and they are all afraid. My mind was full of the pair of bloody hands that held the baby's head and pushed it back. Just thinking about it made me shiver. Aunt Cheen leaned against the wall, and without my asking, she sneered at me. This matter has to start from the years when your grandmother was a midwife. Your grandmother is a very good person. Who in this village dares to say anything bad about her? Your grandmother is 73 this year, and it's time for her to die. But she didn't have a good end, which is also retribution. Aunt Cheen chuckled happily. 73, 84, the king of hell doesn't invite you to go. I clenched the water bottle and didn't dare to drink. How did she die? The dream just now was probably true. Now I wear my grandmother's clothes and sleep in her bed. It's possible that I dream about her life. But how my grandmother died, I really don't know. Why don't you drink water? Drink it quickly. Aunt Jean glanced at me and laughed. After your grandmother gave birth to your father, she became a midwife to earn more food. But in that era, no one was full, and everyone wanted to raise a boy to have more labor. Who would want to raise a girl? Be a midwife? If a girl is born, you have to help others deal with it. But after it is born, it is a life after crossing the Niha Bridge. Killing is a sin after all. So there is the saying of crossing the bridge, do you know? Aunt Jean glanced at me sideways, her face full of sneers. I suddenly thought of the female baby souls who sang the nursery rhyme of crossing the bridge. So, crossing the bridge means killing them? It's to use a foot bath, fill it with water, and then put 2 stone slabs on the left and right. The midwife carried the newborn baby and let his arms rest on the stone slabs. Singing baby crossing the bridge, crossing the bridge, crossing the bridge. Aunt Jean imitated it very well. When I heard the sinister voice, my mind was filled with the pair of blood-stained hands holding the baby's head, and my stomach was throbbing. Oh, the baby fell into the water. Oh, the baby drowned. Aunt Jean acted extremely exaggerated. Then she turned her head and said to me, it was just born. Its arms could not stay on the wooden board for long, and it fell into the foot basin full of water and drowned in a few seconds. The stone bridge in the village did not exist before, it was just a wooden bridge, but that river is said to bring souls to the underworld, so funerals have to cross that bridge. Your grandmother is also a capable person. She found a broken jar to put a baby girl across the bridge and buried it under the river bank. Aunt Jean chuckled. So, the souls of these baby girls will be locked in the jars, and they won't report her to the Hades for killing. She glanced at me and said she was afraid of committing sins, so she kept the placenta and dried it to make it into a purple river placenta. She said that with the placenta, she also had a way to make those baby girls' souls stop looking for her. When I heard this, I suddenly thought of something and clenched the water bottle. Aunt Jean didn't care about this, and still said quietly, her crossing the bridge can indeed reduce the guilt of those who give birth, so people say that she is good at delivering babies, and her reputation has risen. The more she crosses the bridge, the more money she makes. There are more and more jars buried under the river bank. Crossing the bridge is also considered helping others. After all, they don't blame their fathers or mothers, but only blame their own sufferings. This is nothing, Aunt Jean said here, and her tone became mysterious. But when I heard those words in the nursery rhyme of the baby girl's soul, I was completely chilled. I held the water bottle and didn't even dare to look at Aunt Jean. Aunt Jean waved her hand at me. Don't you want to drink water? I'm not thirsty. I held the water bottle and looked at her. Go on. She laughed and didn't care. She said faintly, in the past, everyone was poor, lacking food and clothing. Because of a chicken, a bunch of vegetables, or fighting for water when watering the fields, or chickens pecking at the vegetable fields, they would fight and curse. Do you know what the most powerful curse is? Aunt Jean's tone was extremely excited again. I pinched the water bottle and shook my head. Since I was a child, my grandmother didn't let me go out to play with the children in the village. She said that I was a girl and couldn't be wild. I had to study hard. The mother-in-law was crushed to death. Aunt Jean chuckled. Her laughter was exactly the same as the laughter in the dream just now, and when I was holding the rooster. I was so scared that my hands tightened, and the mineral water bottle I was holding also creaked twice. I quickly put the mineral water bottle aside and kicked it far away with my foot. Aunt Jean seemed to be awakened by the creaking sound of the water bottle, and her tone became normal again. Then there are 2 families with grudges, always thinking of revenge. Think about it, if the family you want to kill with a handful of medicine suddenly has a pregnant woman, and you know that the most famous midwife in the village will come to help. Then you say, it's easy to ask her for help. Aunt Jean raised her hand and made a gesture of holding it, which was exactly the way my grandmother held the baby's head in the dream just now. Then she turned her head and stared at me, saying quietly, at that time, women worked in the fields and were strong, but they were malnourished, and many died of difficult childbirth. As long as they held the baby's head and pushed it in during delivery, the baby would not be born, and 2 lives would be lost. The wife and children would be gone, and there would be no money to remarry, which would mean no descendants. Grandma Chin said, clapping her hands, "This family has a difficult childbirth woman. I think it must have been cursed by the other family, so they asked your grandmother to wait for someone in that family to give birth and then find a difficult childbirth woman to take revenge. Your grandma's business is getting better and better." I suddenly felt a little breathless and looked at Aunt Chin. "How did you know?" But Aunt Chin didn't answer me at all, just kept stretching out her hands to make a gesture of holding. "When the midwife dies, there will be 2 lives. Your grandma is afraid of revenge from the ghost baby, so she will sew up the bottom with thread and sew the ghost baby into the midwife's body to prevent the ghost baby from coming out to find her. She will also cut something and put it in the small jar, together with the jars across the bridge." Hee hee. Hee hee. Aunt Chin laughed louder and louder. Just like a hen laying eggs, she raised her head and giggled. I can now be completely sure that Aunt Chin has a problem. But she leaned in front of the frosted glass and laughed at me. Later, there were more and more jars buried under the river bank. The villagers were afraid of accidents, so everyone donated some money, and rebuilt the river bank and the stone bridge, and pressed the jars under the bridge forever, so that they could not cross the bridge and could never go to the Niha bridge again. No one would go to the King of Hell to sue your grandmother, and the King of Hell would not care about the cases of these evil people. Isn't your grandmother great? She would also collect the afterbirth of the baby girls who crossed the bridge, and eat the afterbirth of the normal-born baby boys herself. Do you know why the afterbirth of the baby girls is collected? Aunt Chin glanced at me. Her eyes were just like the eyes I saw that night, turning like glass balls. To raise you as a substitute? You ate the placenta of those female baby souls, and they will follow the smell and find you. So if you cross the bridge, it means they have crossed the bridge, and they can go to Niha Bridge now, but there are still the midwives who haven't left. Aunt Chin's tone began to become gloomy. The eyes that moved like glass jumped up and down, giggling. So those midwives will take revenge on the villagers. They want you to be buried alive instead of your grandmother, to show that they helped to take revenge, so that those midwives can vent their anger and resentment. As she spoke, she stretched out her hand through the broken glass. The only advantage of the frosted glass of the old-fashioned square window is that after it is broken a little, there are nails and wooden grooves around it, so it won't fall off. But the broken part of the glass is only as big as a fist. Aunt Chin stretched out a pair of hands at the same time, and first her clothes were scratched by the glass and made a rattling sound, and then the glass was squeezed down. She actually stretched out her arms through the lattice window, and then pushed her head in, and the whole window was squeezed by her, making a creaking sound. She held the window sill below with her hands, hung her head upside down, and climbed in while laughing chuckle. The 2 sounds mixed together, plus her weird posture and the jumping eyeballs in her eye sockets, were very creepy. I didn't care about being afraid, turned around and grabbed the stool beside the bed, and hit her head, knocking her unconscious. Holding the bed frame, I raised my foot to her head, trying to kick her out, but she seemed to be stuck in the middle of the window. Just as I raised my hand, the bottle of mineral water that I had thrown aside began to crack again, as if someone was pinching it. While pushing Aunt Chin out with force, I turned my head carefully to look. I saw that there seemed to be many small insects in the unopened bottle, which were seeping out little by little. Just like a water baby soaked in water, it seeps bigger and bigger, making the bottle crackling. And as it gets bigger, it turns out to be countless dead blue hands, scratching around in the water, trying to push the bottle open and get out. The mineral water bottle was only this big. Seeing more and more hands seeping out of the water, and getting bigger and bigger, the bottle cap was washed open with a bang. Then one hand after another, like the little crabs we put in the bottle when we were young, stretched out their claws, pried the bottle mouth, and crawled out little by little along the water. But this was not a crab. After a hand crawled out, it pulled a woman with disheveled hair, blood on the lower body, and a bulging belly. The first one to come out was the silly woman I had seen. As soon as she came out, she immediately looked up and stared at me with resentment. 7th woman. Obviously her head was only the size of the bottle mouth, but I was scared. And as soon as she came out of the bottle mouth, her body seemed to grow as soon as she saw the water. The bottle was already full of women who were struggling to crawl out along the narrow bottle mouth. All kinds of resentful voices came. Seventh aunt. Seventh aunt. Seventh aunt. After a while, more and more women in labor stood in front of the water bottle. I don't know where I got the strength from, but I pushed Aunt Cheen's head hard and pushed her out. As these women in labor crawled out, the house slowly smelled of blood. Each of them walked towards me with their bulging bellies with fetuses twisting inside, and stretched out their hands to me. I shouted help and fire with all my strength, but no one paid attention to me. Seeing more and more women in labor coming out, I glanced at the window lattice that Aunt Cheen was trying to get in, gritted my teeth, and prepared to get out from here, but just as I stretched out my hand to pry open the window and put my head out, my body suddenly tightened. My hand softened, and my body fell heavily to the ground. Turning my head to look at these women in labor, with their bulging bellies, I suddenly felt a wave of sadness in my heart. They now think of me as their grandmother, and they won't let me go. That window is my only way out, just like for those babies trapped in the mother's womb. They also have only one way out, but it was forcibly blocked by my grandmother. These midwives also made me experience what those babies who were trapped to death experienced. That window is wide enough for me to get my head out, but it is not wide enough for my shoulders, so I can't get out at all. If I get in, I will be trapped to death. I saw those midwives stretching their hands and pulling at me. I looked at this familiar room, and then looked at their bloody appearance, and my heart gradually became peaceful. My grandmother was so wicked that she killed 2 people and caused a corpse. In order to prevent people from going to the Yama palace to complain, she also sewed the corpse and trapped the soul, so that the mother and child would be trapped under the bridge forever. In this way, everyone who walked across the bridge would be like stepping on them all the time, and they would never be able to turn over. But if there was no grandmother, according to my parents' opinion, I might have crossed the bridge. She raised me as a substitute, but she let me live once after all. Since it's my turn to atone, let me do it. Otherwise, with so many lives and decades of accumulated resentment, what can I use to pay it back? I looked at them, slowly calmed down, closed my eyes, and leaned against the wall. I just felt a little regretful. The afternoon I received the news of my grandmother's death. The weather was hot and humid, and a colleague talked about some milk tea in the group chat. I actually wanted to drink it, but after looking at it, a cup of milk tea cost 16 yuan, which was almost my daily vegetable money, so I didn't want to spend it. For this village, except for my grandmother, I don't miss anything. I just want to save a down payment, buy a house outside, and take my grandmother to live there. She always told me that she didn't want to stay in the village, because there were too many right and wrong in the village. Maybe she also knew that if she stayed here, one day, she would be retaliated by these women who had difficulty giving birth. 7th woman. A resentful voice sounded in my ears, followed by countless cold hands pressing on me. 2 pairs of hands forcibly opened my eyes, and several other hands pried open my mouth. 2 hands reached into my mouth and held my tongue, so that I couldn't make any sound. I suddenly knew how my grandma died. Because a jar appeared in front of my eyes. I instinctively reached out to struggle, but these midwives held my hands tightly, one hand after another. Then they put the jar on my head, and they also wanted me to be trapped in this jar after death. I wanted to turn my head, but there were too many midwives, and my whole body was pressed by their hands. I couldn't even close my eyes, because my eyes were always held by them. They wanted me to watch how I was suffocated to death. Repaying in kind. Seeing that the jar was about to be put on my head, I suddenly heard a sigh. Let her go. Then a slender white hand held the jar and took it away. It was the man in white. He looked at me with pity. He said to the women who had difficulty in childbirth, every wrong has its perpetrator, every debt has its creditor. The women who had difficulty in childbirth seemed to be very respectful to him. They slowly retreated to the corner and then disappeared. Only the bottle of mineral water with the cap opened was still gurgling. I looked at the man in white and suddenly felt extremely safe. I relaxed and leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. Let's go. Even if they let you go, these people in the village will still let you take your grandmother's place in the grave to avoid retaliation. He waved his hand lightly, and the locked door opened. I looked up at him and said, "Why do you want me to be buried in the ground? Why are you helping me?" Those female baby souls, called him river god, judging from his arrangement, letting me pass through the bridge hole, was actually to release them. He smiled bitterly at me and said, "Those baby girls have been trapped, but the jar that trapped the midwives was broken by blind Chen after the silly woman was killed, and some of them were released. They killed your grandmother first, and the fourth grandmother who collected the coffin, hee. It's the same as before, thinking of being a good person and playing the peacemaker, so he used a secret technique to sew up your grandmother's body and let these midwives be trapped in the straw raincoat your grandmother was wearing. The old Taoist priest also proposed that you suppress the soul in the coffin and bury it alive with the coffin, so that all the midwives can vent their anger. But you just saw that your grandmother's soul was trapped in the jar by these midwives. She can't go to the Yama palace, and those sins will naturally not be borne by her. If this substitute doesn't die to bear the responsibility, it will fall on those people in the village who killed baby girls or secretly found your grandmother to make her die in childbirth. But if you don't cross the bridge hole, those baby girls will be trapped in the jar under the bridge for generations, and they will never be reborn." He smiled bitterly at me with reluctance. "I have listened to their resentment for decades, and I want to help them. These people in your village are also afraid of retribution. They will definitely bury you alive to let those women who are in labor vent their anger. I have asked them to find the creditors." Seeing that I didn't move, he stretched out his hand to open the door. "Go quickly, if it's too late, they will come to catch you again." He didn't tell me why he wanted to save me. But he obviously didn't care about the lives of those instigators in the village. I didn't want to die either, so I quickly turned over and ran out. The man in white handed me a half-empty bottle of mineral water. This water was originally injected with river water, so they can come in with the water. Now it's flowing out. Drink some water. With this water in your stomach, they won't bother you anymore. My mouth was dry and scabby. I looked at him, took the water, drank it all in one breath, and ran out. When I reached the door, I turned my head and looked at the man in white. "What should I call you? If it is really the river god, I will set up a tablet for him in the future, and I will have to burn incense every morning and evening." "Guanza." He smiled at me and motioned me to go quickly. Guanza. A light flashed in my mind, and I suddenly remembered it. When I was a child, every July 15th, other families would burn paper at dusk and take their ancestors home for worship. But my grandmother always took me there in the middle of the night. But unlike other families, they didn't burn paper all the way home, but put a lot of offerings at the bridge head, burned a lot of paper money, and said a lot of words. She would prick her and my fingers, squeeze out blood and drip it on the paper money. I would cry when she pricked me, and she would give me some food and let me sit aside to eat while she burned paper with peace of mind. Every year at this time I would see a man standing under the bridge, looking up. I thought he was greedy for my food, so I would pass the food in my hand to him. After 2 or 3 years, it became a familiar thing. I would talk to him when Grandma wasn't paying attention, asking him who he was and whether he would steal the offerings after we left. He just told me that his name was Guanza, and he didn't want to steal the offerings, but just wanted to hear what Grandma had to say. Later, when I grew up, I began to understand and felt that something was wrong. I told Grandma about this, and when she listened, she showed fear in her eyes, and she never let me go to the bridge to burn paper again. Instead, before burning paper every time, she would cut my finger, squeeze out some blood, and put it on the paper money. Even now, it's the same. When I was in school, July was summer vacation. Even if I was working during the summer vacation, she would ask me to come back and let me put some blood on the paper money, and she would burn it. When I was at work, if I couldn't get a leave, she would ask me to draw some blood, put it in the freezer, and express it back. The reason she gave was that I was difficult to raise when I was a child, and she made a promise, and this was to help me fulfill my wish. Now I think about it, she was using my blood to sacrifice to the ghosts under the bridge, so that those women who had difficult childbirth would come to me in the future. For so many years, I actually forgot Guanza. He is the river god, and he knows everything that Grandma did. I looked at him and whispered, "You hear her burning paper at the bridge every year. Has she ever?" I couldn't say the rest of the words. What did she have? If Grandma had repented, she wouldn't have kept me as a substitute. But she was also afraid that the silly woman would get pregnant under the bridge hole where the bone jar was buried, and those wronged souls would become her great-grandchildren and come to her to claim her life and revenge the Kong family. So she went back to her old ways and killed the silly woman. Blind Shen must have known about this, so he broke the jars containing the things of the women who had difficulty giving birth and released them, which was also revenge for the silly woman. Guangzi saw that I remembered and smiled at me. "Let's go." "Thank you." I walked out directly. I am very familiar with the way out of the village. Unless you go over the big mountain behind and go around to other villages, you have to cross the bridge. Now people don't go into the mountains to collect firewood or anything. There are no roads. There are many snakes and wild boars. But when I think of the chaotic situation at the bridge, there must be many people guarding it. I gritted my teeth and turned to walk back to the mountain. As soon as I reached the hillside behind the village, I saw Kong Yuxuan standing there, talking to himself. There was no fear on his face, as if he was still coaxing someone with a joking smile. But there was no one opposite him. My heart skipped a beat, and I suddenly remembered what those ants said, that he had cheated that silly woman on this hillside. Just now, Guangzi asked those women who had difficulty giving birth to come to find creditors, among whom was that silly woman. I glanced at Kong Yuxuan, and for a moment I hesitated whether to call him. Just then, Kong Yuxuan turned his head and saw me. He was stunned at first, and then he immediately reacted and yelled at me, "Kong Yumian, why did you run out?" Taoist who has made a paper man, wrote Grandma's birth date, and prepared to let the paper man stand up from the coffin on behalf of Grandma, so that you can carry it across the bridge and bury it in the chosen place. You still want to run away at this time. You have to bury Grandma in peace, otherwise I will be killed by you, and those who come to see Grandma during the holidays will be killed by you. As he said, he picked up a stick as thick as a baby's arm and ran towards me. So those who came to see Grandma during the New Year were not here to express their gratitude, but to keep her mouth shut, so that she wouldn't tell anyone about the bad things she had done in the past. Guangji was right. In the eyes of Taoist Hu, it was very clear what choice he made, to exchange my life for the lives of so many people in the village. Kong Yuxuan ran towards me, still shouting. I suddenly felt ridiculous for wanting to save him just now. Some people may feel guilty when they are calm after doing evil things. For example, Grandma usually worships Buddha statues, smiles and gives candy to children, treats me better, and pays for me to go to college. But all these are just to make them feel better. Once they are in danger, they will still do evil. I stared at Kong Yuxuan and sneered, "Who were you talking to just now?" Kong Yuxuan was stunned for a moment, turned his head and looked to the side. On the hillside where he was alone, that silly woman appeared beside him without knowing when. She was smiling at him with a big belly. Kong Yuxuan suddenly came to his senses, his legs trembling with fear, and he was about to swing the stick. But one after another, women in labor came out from behind the silly woman with their bellies bulging. They stretched out their hands, opened their eyes and mouths, and held his hands, just like they did to me. Then the silly woman held the stick and poked it down little by little from Kong Yuxuan's mouth that was forcibly opened. Kong Yuxuan's eyelids were stretched open, and he tried to look at me and ask for help. But the rough skin of the stick scraped the corners of his mouth, oozing bright red blood. Then it poked down little by little. I suddenly thought of the death of the old Taoist priest, and Guangzi's saying every injustice has its perpetrator, and every debt has its creditor. My heart was throbbing, and I covered my mouth tightly to prevent myself from screaming. With this delay, the thick and long stick had already been half stabbed in. Kong Yuxuan was held down by so many midwives that he couldn't even move his fingers. He could only watch the stick pierce his body, bit by bit. The midwives held him down tightly and stared at me intently. The sound of villagers shouting came from not far away. I glanced at Kong Yuxuan, who was slowly moving, and ran up the mountain. I'm not familiar with the way up the mountain, but when people are running for their lives, they always use their instincts. Just as I ran over the hillside, I heard Taoist master who came hurriedly, shouting, "It's bad. Kong Yuxuan has been retaliated like my master." Kong Yemian, who was guarding the coffin, ran away, and those women who were released from the midwifery followed her and ran around the village. "Find her quickly, otherwise you will not survive tonight, and all of you will die." Then someone struck the gong and shouted, "She ran to the mountain, search the mountain quickly." I was anxious, but entering the mountain is not my strong point. For Mad Chin's words, the people in the whole village, let alone let the baby girl cross the bridge. Even if they didn't directly participate in causing people to die in childbirth, there are always relatives who did these things. In addition, 4 people have died, and no one wants to die themselves, or their relatives die tragically, which is equivalent to telling others that their family members have done these evil things before. The villagers worked together to search the mountain from all directions, trying to catch me. There was no way I could escape, so I finally thought about it and found a remote, bush-covered small earth pit and hid in it. I thought I would run to the town after dark, take a taxi to the county seat, and then call the police. The small earth pit was too small, and I was stiff after lying there for a while, and bugs would crawl onto my body from time to time along my collar and trouser legs. Not long after, 2 or 3 people came here with sticks, knocking on the bushes. As they searched, they chatted, "Will burying Lao Kong's daughter alive really work?" This is the method suggested by Taoist master Lao Hu. It will be useful if we catch her. There is one thing I don't understand. For those female babies who drowned while crossing the bridge, Chipa put the bodies in jars, right? But what did Chipa put in those women who had difficulty in childbirth? Can she trap those women who had difficulty in childbirth? Hair stained with amniotic fluid and fetal blood. A man with a rough voice sneered, "The bottom, a small bunch, cut it off and put it in that small jar." Otherwise, how would Blind Shin know which one is for the baby corpse and which one is for the woman who had difficulty in childbirth? I heard that 4th grandma put the hairs that fell out were stuffed into the straw raincoat and used as a shroud for Chipa. She let them prick Chipo's body all the time. As long as her granddaughter, who was raised as a substitute, was buried alive in the coffin, everything would be fine. Alas, it was also a sin. In other places, there were also people who gave birth to daughters but didn't want them. In fact, it was fine. The blame should be on Chipa. She was afraid of retribution, so she had to make a jar to trap people and prevent them from reincarnation. She did a sin and was afraid of death and responsibility. Those women who had difficulty in childbirth were sinners. When the baby was about to be born, she pushed the head in again, killing 2 people with one body and dying in agony. She had the heart to do it. Another person also sighed. The man said coldly, "Lao Kong's daughter, or her own granddaughter?" She was willing to give it up. I lay in the pit, trying not to think about these things. As long as I escaped from the village, I could survive. But those people seemed to be getting more and more upset, and the sticks they swung became heavier and heavier. I froze and dared not move, just begging them not to move. But at this moment, the smell of incense suddenly jumped in. I felt bad in my heart instantly, and followed the people who were hitting the bushes with sticks, and stopped moving. But the smell of incense, as if being pulled by a string, came towards me. When my grandmother offered incense to the Buddha statue before, she told me that some people would make incense with the blood of their blood relatives, and wrap it with their hair to find their closest relatives. There was a faint smell of burning hair in this incense. The people searching the mountain nearby didn't move. It must be that the contact person came to catch me. I lay in the pit, not daring to move. If I get caught again this time, I'm afraid I won't have a chance to run away. At this moment, a cold little hand suddenly patted my hand lying on the ground. I looked at the pale little hand and was frightened. I turned my head with difficulty and saw that it was the little girl who was sitting on the coffin and feeding me water. She squatted beside me, tilted her head and smiled at me, and handed me her hand. The river god said, "You can't run away, let me take you out." For some reason, my heart softened. Compared to people, I actually believed in these ghosts. The little girl led me up from under the bushes. A cool breath came to me along her little hand. There were 3 people holding sticks outside, and one was holding a mobile phone and sending messages, signaling them not to move. One person held a stick of incense in his hand, and the incense was like a string, drilling directly under the bushes where I was hiding. But I had already come out from under, but they seemed to not see me. She smiled at me. Did you drink the river water? The river god will protect you, they can't see you. The river god is the best, he must have thought of it a long time ago. So Guangzi said that there was no river water in the bottle of water, but it was actually a lie to me, just to let me drink it without worry. With the little girl leading me, I seemed to be invisible, and there was no movement even when I stepped on the bushes. We walked around the 3 people quietly and headed for the village. The little girl explained to me, the river god originally wanted you to run from the bridgehead. Since he said he would let you go, he would definitely help you. As a result, you actually ran back to the mountain, so the river god had to let me come. I really didn't expect this. We didn't walk far before we met people searching the mountain. They came here in groups of 3 or 5, and each of them held a stick of incense in their hands. The incense must be made of the blood and hair of the closest relatives. Kong Yuxuan is dead, and my blood relatives are only my parents. They really want to kill me, for fear that they can't find me. I felt sad, holding the little girl's hand, and strode towards the village. At this time, there were people howling in the village from time to time, as if someone's family had died again, and so on. I walked along the road where my grandmother's funeral was held and walked to the bridgehead. On the way, I met many people with fear on their faces, and they hurried out of the village, but it seemed that no one could see me and the little girl. The coffin had been covered with a shed to block the sun, while Taoist Master Hu and Lao Jiang, who made incense and candles, were making a paper man. I didn't expect that he was also a paper man. No wonder he knew so much. Just as we passed by the shed, the coffin that was originally sealed had been opened. I just glanced at it and saw that Grandma's body was lying naked in the coffin, and the thread that sewed the body had been cut open. Taoist Master Hu handed the straw raincoat that was rumored to have hidden the hair of women who had given birth to Lao Jiang. While Lao Jiang was wrapping the paper man with the straw raincoat, he used a pen to paste Grandma's photo on the paper man and drew the eyes and mouth to look like they were sewn together. Taoist Master Hu even drew a tube of blood from Grandma's body, then dipped a brush in it and dotted the blood on the forehead, chest, and back of the paper man with the photo. Lao Jiang watched, smoking a pipe. As long as we catch the daughter of the old Kong family and bury her alive with the paper figurine on her back, this matter will be over. Yeah. We have to sprinkle the grave with black dog blood and lock them up with iron chains so that they can never come out. Taoist Master Whose face was gloomy, turning his head to look at the paper-folding craftsman, Lao Jiang, this will make them never reincarnate, it's too cruel. Think about your master's death. Think about whether one person dies or the whole village dies. We can't do anything. The paper-folding craftsman named Lao Jiang smoked and blew smoke rings. Fourth Grandma also wanted to save people, so she sewed the hair into the raincoat, but Kong Yemian failed to hold the coffin down, and she died first. Master Hu looked at the back mountain. He sighed quietly. I heard that the village chief died as tragically as Grandma Chi, and those women who had difficulty giving birth would not let him go. The old couple of the Lu family also died. I heard that they asked Grandma Chi to help them kill Yang Xi's wife, who was fighting for water with them. One corpse and 2 lives, the couple also died with their eyes wide open like Grandma Chi. The incense and candles burned out and they died in the underworld. Everyone walked over the bridge and pressed them under the bridge. The deeper the resentment, the greater the revenge. If we don't trap them again, you and I will die. Lao Jiang patted the pipe on the ground and smiled bitterly. If you think so, it's worth it to kill Kong Yemian. If Chipa didn't raise Kong Yemian as a substitute to make these wronged ghosts and evil spirits relieve their resentment, she would have died at birth just like her sister who crossed the bridge. Even now, Lao Kong would rather give birth to a son who is lazy and eats his parents than to raise a daughter who is admitted to university. After all, sons are their own, and daughters are other people's. Lao Jiang sighed. He said faintly, Xiao Hu, just think of Kong Yamian as a ghost who should have died long ago. I trembled in my heart when I heard it. It turned out that there was a sister who died across the bridge in front of me. I don't know why, the little girl who was holding my hand, originally smiling, flashed a gloomy anger on her face. She pulled me to the bridge head and signaled me to go quickly. The stone bridge was just in front of me. I had walked over it countless times before, but I had never felt that the bridge was so cold. How many people in the village knew what was under the bridge? Just as I was about to step up, Master Hu's cell phone rang. After listening to a few words, his face darkened, and he immediately turned to Lao Jiang and said, Kong Yemian ran away. Lao Jiang's face changed immediately, and then he let go of the paper man. Lao Hu, since this is the case, we can only use a ruthless trick. I didn't know what a ruthless trick was, and the little girl holding my hand immediately changed her face. He pulled me to run on the bridge. Quick, jump into the river, quick. Before I understood what was going on, I heard Master Hu sigh, and then he took out a piece of yellow paper and a photo from his arms and pasted them on the paper man. The yellow paper was written with my birth date, and the photo was also my photo. In an instant, Taoist Master Hu shouted in a deep voice, every wrong has its perpetrator, every debt has its creditor. All wronged souls, listen to my command, the seventh wife is here. Before I understood what was going on, I felt that my body, which was being led by the little girl, seemed to become heavier in an instant. Seeing that the stone bridge was just ahead, the little girl pulled me forward with all her strength. But at this moment, my parents suddenly rushed out from both sides of the bridge and rushed towards me. They seemed to be able to see me, and rushed towards me from left and right, and directly pushed me down. The little girl also screamed in fear. I was completely unprepared, and was directly pushed to the ground by my father, who punched me twice. I told you to run. I told you to run. You killed your brother, and you want to kill the whole village, you damned one. The little girl screamed on the side, but she was a ghost and could not help at all. I was beaten so hard that I saw stars, and the last thought in my mind disappeared. It was Master Hu spoke again, stop fighting. Lao Jiang pulled my dad away and sighed at me. My mom was on the side, just sobbing and looking at me. How could you harm your brother? You killed your brother, you have to pay with your life. Just because I don't want to die, I killed him? But he is the one who did all the bad things. I sat on the ground, letting my nose bleed, and smiled bitterly. Even Lao Jiang knew that Kong Yuxuan was lazy and useless, but in their eyes, that son was a treasure. Just when I turned my head to look, I found that Master Hu and Lao Jiang were staring at the little girl next to me. My heart suddenly moved. I hurriedly stood up, pushed the little girl, and shouted at her, run. She also heard what Master Hu said just now, that we will never be reborn. They want to save the people in this village, and my life and theirs are not lives. You still want to run, still run. My father said to me and wanted to punch me again. I have died twice, and the blood relationship is long gone. When he swung his fist, I kicked him. Then, with the force of the kick, I turned over and dragged the little girl to the bridge. While running, I shouted, Guangza! Guangza! But the little girl seemed to be stunned in the same place, staring at my parents, muttering, this is my parents, so it's like this. I was shocked and turned my head to look at the girl. Only then did I realize that she was a little bit like me when I was a child. Just at this time, Guangza floated out from under the bridge. He glanced at me, reached out and hugged the little girl, and nodded to me, she is indeed your sister. The little girl was still staring at my parents, looking unbelievable. I was completely stunned. It turned out that there was really such a sister who was crossed over the bridge. Just at this moment, the villagers ran over, shouting, here, catch the substitute of Chipa, everyone is saved. Guangza hurriedly pushed the little girl under the bridge hole and turned to pull me. But Taoist who waved his hand and threw the paper man in the raincoat over me, covering me with it, hurry up and put it on her. My parents hurriedly tied the belt of the raincoat for me. My mother cursed while wrapping it, you have no conscience, give me back my son. Give me back my son. He kept hitting me, pinching me, kicking me. Guangza reached out and pulled me, motioning me to follow him. I looked at the villagers holding ropes, sticks, or chains. My mother who punched and kicked me, and my father who wanted to tie me up and bury me alive with the paper man. My heart gradually became heavy. It turns out that if you sacrifice one person, you can save everyone. If you don't save them, it's wrong. But what did those women who were in labor have done wrong? What did those babies who were resented, pushed back into the mother's body, suffocated to death, and sealed in the body, never seeing the light of day have done wrong? Those baby girls, they gave birth but didn't raise them, and they were afraid of killing them, so they had to make a bridge to cross, blaming them for drowning themselves. It's really funny. I let myself be tied up, and let the paper man be tied to my back. I just looked at Guangza, who stretched out his hand to pull me. Why do you let all those women who were in labor out? According to Aunt Chin, when the river bank was built, it was to hide the jars that my grandmother had buried. How many jars could a blind man like Chin smash? Aunt Chin came to me with a water bottle, which contained the silly woman killed by Kong Yuxuan. But when I passed through the bridge hole, I saw that there was no silly woman in the ones I saw. They wanted to come out, but Guangza looked back. In other words, there are still some women who are in labor under the bridge hole. Guangza frowned at me, and then looked at the villagers who were indignant and shouted to tie me up with iron chains, or knock me out directly, and carry paper figures to get up from the coffin for my grandmother, and then bury her. Until now, they still don't say bury alive directly, but say bury her in peace? It's as ironic as saying that they crossed the bridge. Pointing to the bottom of the bridge hole. Then, he waved his sleeves. A gust of wind rolled up directly from under the bridge hole, flying sand and rocks, covering the sky and the sun. Cross the bridge, baby cross the bridge. My nominal sister came back with the souls of the baby girls. They untied me in a hurry, just like they took me down from the coffin that night. Hold Kong Yumian tightly. Those wronged souls won't let her be buried. Don't let Kong Yumian. Taoist priest who waved his Taoist robe and shouted. But he couldn't speak afterwards, because Guangza stuffed 2 pebbles into his mouth. Lao Jiang took the pipe and wanted to hit me, but Guangza waved his sleeves and threw him into the coffin. This time, the souls of the baby girls led me and jumped down the bridge together. Under the bridge, there were many women who had difficulty giving birth. But this time, they didn't look at me with resentment, but with desire in their eyes. They all pointed at the river bank beside the bridge and looked at me pleadingly. I picked up a stone and threw it at a crack. Although cement was used to build this stone bridge, it was decades old after all, and there were frequent floods, or Guangza's help. After a while, some stones were broken loose. On the bridge, the strong wind brought by Guangza was still blowing. I broke the loose stones, took a longer stone, and pried the ones next to it loose. Hatred can also stimulate people's potential. However, after prying open 5 or 6 stones, there were rows of pickled cabbage jars that were half a person's embrace. The jar lid was sealed with mud, and there were also talismans and other things pressed on it. I picked up the stone and smashed the jar directly. The fine gray bones inside fell out with the jar fragments. I don't know which little girl's breathing sounded so clear in the sobbing wind. I suddenly became extremely excited, and I raised my foot and kicked the stone inward along the place where it was broken. The sound of the jar breaking came, and the screams of little girls one after another, and the sound of someone sobbing came. When a large, human-shaped hole was revealed, behind the stone wall of the bridge hole, there were piles of jars. The big ones were the size of half a person's embrace, and the small ones were the size of a rice bowl today. The big ones broke, and all the tiny gray bones fell out. The small ones broke, and a bunch of slightly curly hair fell out. I smashed harder and harder, and the wind on the bridge became stronger and stronger, but people's screams began to be heard. Someone is dead. The midwife has crushed someone to death, don't worry about it, run. The midwife has crushed someone to death. But I still smashed and kicked the river bank tirelessly, and the jars broke one by one, and the cheers or sobs were extremely refreshing to me. The bridge hole, which was originally crowded with people, slowly became empty. I don't know how long it took. I broke both sides of the bridge hole, and I wanted to smash both ends of the bridge hole, but Guangza held my hand and shook his head at me. It's all here. I turned my head and looked at how many jars were placed on both sides of the bridge hole. Now there were gray bones floating in the river. My grandmother is 73 years old this year. When I was in elementary school, people still asked her to deliver babies. At that time, the inspection was strict, and I often heard that someone's daughter-in-law was in poor health and gave birth to a dead baby. Some people sighed, some laughed and said nothing, and some people knew it clearly. But no one took the dead babies seriously, because everyone in the village tacitly agreed that no matter how outstanding the girl was, she belonged to someone else's family. No matter how useless the boy was, he was still his own family. I looked at these broken jars, looked at Guangza again, and listened to the people on the bridge who seemed to have seen a ghost. No, it was a scream of seeing a ghost, and the body softened and fell into the river. When I woke up, I was already in the town hospital. The policeman who was guarding my bed was actually a policeman from the town police station. He told me that something happened in the village and that everyone who attended my grandmother's funeral was dead. Someone must have poisoned the food, and those people had hallucinations. None of them had any external injuries, but they all stared with their eyes open and their mouths clasped, and their deaths were extremely strange. Some even opened the coffin and stripped off my grandmother's shroud. When the leader of the police team asked me a lot of questions. He seemed to know something and asked me directly whose body was in the jar in the bridge hole, and what was strange about the straw raincoat and the human hair caught in the straw ropes. Why did Kong Yuxuan and the old Taoist priest die differently from others? Why did Taoist Hu and Lao Jiang go crazy? I just said that during the funeral, there was a strong wind and the villagers wanted to cross the bridge like crazy. Then I was pushed off the bridge, fell and had a bloody head, and fainted. I don't know anything else. I do have a head injury. Even if they find out that I was beaten, I will just say I forgot about it. Captain Wen obviously didn't believe it, but I didn't change my words, so I had to give up. Just after he left, a handsome man in black from their team smiled at me and said, "Guangza told me everything. Don't worry, I will let Team Wen solve the case. Anyway, they can't solve many cases. You can rest assured and recover. Guangza will send the souls of those baby girls to the Naiha Bridge and help those women who had difficulty in childbirth to come out of their mothers' bodies. Then they will come to see you." I listened to his words, my whole body tensed up, but he smiled at me and said faintly, "By the way, when I came here, I saw an interesting person under the overpass in the town. He seems to be from your village. His name is Blind Chin. He can actually tell fortunes. If you have time, go see him." I listened and my heart skipped a beat. Blind Chin. The matter of crossing the bridge and the women who had difficulty in childbirth was brought up after so many years because Kong Yuxuan cheated and slept with Blind Chin's wife, silly woman. It was also because Blind Chin smashed those jars filled with fur and released the midwife, which led to the following events. It seemed that no one said where Blind Chin went. He was actually still alive, in the town. I looked at the yellowish eyes of this man called Xianyu, and suddenly felt a little cold. After 2 days in the hospital, I was able to be discharged. Except for the punches from my dead father, I didn't have any external injuries. I was just tired, hungry, and overly frightened. As soon as I was discharged, I found Blind Chin under the bridge that Xianyu mentioned. Under the bridge, there were either fortune tellers, ancestral plasters, or game scramblers. Blind Chin was easy to find, because although he was blind, he didn't wear sunglasses like other fortune tellers. He just sat there with a pair of eyes covered with polyps. Maybe it was his eyes. His eyes were too fierce, so people passing by would take a second look at him. His business was actually pretty good. I stood there and watched for a while. He told 2 people 20 yuan each and earned 40 yuan. He used to be a fortune teller and knew all the tricks. After everyone left, I sat in front of him and reported my birth date, but didn't say my name. He just laughed and said, "I have to thank you for the village." I thought that the death of the 7 wives was enough. Who knew they actually wanted to bury you alive, to suppress your soul? Alas, I have done too many sins. I just want to do more sins to suppress my sins, but I end up doing more and more sins. Blind Chen sighed when he heard my birth date. You did it on purpose, right? I looked into his eyes and said in a deep voice, tell me about it. Blind Chen pointed to his eyes. Do you know how you became blind? I was stunned for a moment. His eyes seemed to be blinded after being injured. The old village chief poked my eyes blind, and then fourth grandma helped me sew them up. Blind Chen laughed and reached out to flip his eyelids. Can you still see the stitches? How could you see any stitches in those eyes covered with polyps? But because the eyeballs were completely necrotic and sunken inward, they were pulled apart by him, which made them even more terrifying. Don't you want to ask the old village chief why he stabbed my eyes blind? Blind Chen played the arrow. He chuckled and said, because when I was 4 years old, I saw what Grandma Chi did when she delivered my mother. I told my dad, but Grandma Chi said I was just a kid talking nonsense. The old village chief was afraid that I would go out and talk nonsense, so he pushed me down the mountain where I had just chopped firewood. My eyes were poked blind by those firewood sticks. He also said that I didn't look at the road and fell down. He pretended to ask the fourth grandmother to sew my eyes. He also threatened me that if I told this to others, he would sew my mouth next time. Blind Chen's arrow skills were not good, and he sobbed. He lowered his voice and said, but I didn't accept it. I told everyone I met. But the villagers either laughed at me or said that I secretly watched my mother give birth. They didn't take it seriously. In fact, they all knew in their hearts that what I said was true. I told my father again and again, and he also went to find the old village chief, but later, he fell into the river and drowned. I became a blind man without a father or a mother, and no one in the village believed me. I had forgotten all these things and let myself be a blind fortune teller for the rest of my life. Blind Chen put down the arrow. He leaned closer to me and said, your name is Mian Mian, right? I'm telling you this because I want to tell you that those people in the village deserve to die. Chipa is doing evil, but they are helping Chipa to do evil. I knew about your second-rate brother when he used candy and biscuits to deceive Xiaohong a few times. I went to him, but he beat me up. I also went to your father and your grandmother, but they just blamed me for not being able to take care of my wife. Chipa also threatened me that if I told anyone about this, she would cut off my tongue. My mouth was sewed up. I suddenly remembered how my eyes became blind, how my parents and my stillborn brother died. So I told Xiaohong that next time your brother looks for her, take him to the bridge hole. I want to see if Chipa is afraid that the evil ghost under the bridge hole will be reincarnated as her great-grandson. Haha. But I didn't expect that she was really cruel. Cruel. Even when she died, she was so cruel that you buried her alive and let her take the blame in the Yama Palace. She is really cruel. I am not as good as her. Blind Chen kept talking. But I just felt cold all over, slowly got up, and wandered around the street a little at a loss. It turned out that in many things, the victims had let it go and passed it. But the perpetrators never think they are wrong. I don't know how far I walked, and I unknowingly arrived at the riverside, and saw Guangzi standing on the river in white clothes, coming over the waves. He smiled at me and handed me a flower. This is manjasaka, also known as the flower of the other shore. It was brought to you by the souls of the female babies who went to the underworld, as well as the women who had difficulty giving birth and their children. They all thank you. If you hadn't smashed the jar in the end, their bodies would have seen the light of day again and their revenge would have been avenged. Otherwise, they would never have entered the underworld and would never have been reincarnated. Guangzi took my hand, put the flower in my hand, and held my hand again. Kong Yamian, good will be rewarded with good, and evil will be rewarded with evil. They killed others and wanted to kill you. You just saved yourself. What's wrong? Don't blame yourself. I looked at the flower of the other shore in my hand and Guangzi standing on the water, and suddenly I thought it through. I whispered to him, I didn't expect that the first flower I received was this. Guangzi's face seemed to be red, but he didn't take back my hand. I looked up at him. I heard that if you have a god, you can call him any time if you have a god's tablet. Is that the same for you? Then I can have a god's tablet in my room, and you can come to me anytime? Guangzi's face seemed to be redder than the red spider lily in his hand. But I was just afraid. I wanted to worship him as a river god, and he would bless me at any time. Why is he blushing? The end.